So Mike was talking about the relation between the public and the global and the local, and the text I wrote for this or gave you for this symposium is an extract from a book I'm writing with Eva and Chris Ansell from UC Berkeley, and it's a book that will come out on Emerald in golden open access, and it's a book on local co-creation of global sustainable development goals. So we are in this book exactly trying to link the global and the local. And I think everything Mike said would be somehow in the book, and I totally agree with what he said. So there are many ways to approach this idea about local co-creation of global sustainability goals. And this is just one short narrative that will end with what I'm started with, this idea of local co-creation of global sustainability goal. So I'll talk about public value, the discovery of public value in public administration research, and how we can see this public value as a game changer for the way we understand governance. Okay, so what we have seen back in history, we also talked a lot about history and the past today, but we saw a public sector that expanded, especially in the time after the Second World War. And this public sector that suddenly emerged and expanded was very, very bureaucratic. It took the work of Max Weber and Wilson as the kind of template for how to construct the public sector. And today, bureaucracy is, almost used in a derogatory way. When we say something sounds bureaucratic, we kind of mean, are you out of your mind? This is really bad. But I just want to remind us all that when bureaucracy emerged and was introduced in the public sector, especially in the time after the Second World War, it was a great improvement to what was before. And there are some key features of bureaucracy that are very hard to do without, like some degree of centralized control and horizontal specialization can really help us to enhance efficiency, and following rules and some kind of meritocratic recruitment of public employees can be a great help to reduce or fight corruption. And I'm speaking here from Denmark, which is the country in the world that is #1 in fighting corruption. We have very little of it and a lot of bureaucracy. So what also is interesting about bureaucracy is that, at least in some countries, bureaucracy was combined with what I will call professional rule. So professional rule is the idea that we should somehow give frontline staff, professionally trained people like doctors and nurses and school teachers and civil servants, and etc. We should give those people at the front line an enhanced autonomy to do their job. And we should do that not to please them, but as a kind of an exchange, or as a part of a deal or agreement that required that in return they should give us high performance in terms of welfare services. So I thought that that is a very important complement or supplement to bureaucracy. So we all know the story that we had the expansion of bureaucracy that kind of gave way to a new national sport in most countries. And that sport was exactly bureaucracy bashing. So we saw from the late 60s, early 70s onwards, a whole lot of criticism of bureaucracy. Like Anthony Downs, he talked about the ossification of public organizations or public bureaucracy. We had the work of Niskanen and many other public choice theories to argue that there would be an inbuilt structural tendency for public service to be too poor and too expensive when produced by bureaucracy. We had Jan-Erik Lane, a Swedish colleague who used principal agency theory in relation to the public sector, arguing that public employees would tend to act opportunistically, only caring about their own interest and not about users of society. And we had, of course, famous ex-president Ronald Reagan, who famously said, public bureaucracy is not the solution, but the problem. And basically, neoliberals have criticized public bureaucracy for being like a blood-sucking parasite, squandering value produced in the private sector. And we all know what the cure was, according to public choice theory and neoliberals. That was the introduction of new public management, giving us less state, less bureaucracy, and more market competition instead. So that's a very short story about the rise and fall of bureaucracy, if you want. I think this was in a way very, very unfortunate, although there are, of course, problems with bureaucracy such as paternalism and many other things. But, you know, this constant bashing of bureaucracy led to this, you know, what I call an inferiority complex in the public sector. You know, people employed in the public sector, they didn't think highly of themselves and what they were doing, because they were constantly told that they were just, you know, serving themselves and not anybody else, and they were just squandering value produced by the private sector. So I think in this slide, it is highly welcome that we saw the work of Harvard professor Mark Moore, who demonstrated that the public sector is not simply squandering values produced in the private sector, but actually producing its own distinct value that he called public value. And there's now a lot of research on public value and public value management, which is extremely popular for some reason in the Netherlands and in Australia, of all countries. But what is, of course, interesting is how we define public value, and there's a whole discussion there. I'll just define public value here as what is valuable to the public and what publics in the plural value. And of course, that creates an ambiguity, because what we think is good for the public, for the general public, or for the public sphere is not always valued in exactly the same way by different groups and constituencies, and vice versa also. Okay, so very briefly on the work of Mark Moore, which I think is important. Well, he also gave a new role to public managers, because he portrayed public managers and as a kind of entrepreneurs or explorers who were constantly searching for new ways of producing public value. And of course, it's a problem in a democracy if we have public managers to single-handedly define public value. So his idea was that these public managers should develop public value propositions and go to their authorizing environment consisting of elected politicians and stakeholders, etc., and have authorization and gain legitimate support for their public value propositions. And after that, they should go back home and trim their organization, build organizational capacities to secure implementation of public value. So I'm just saying that, you know, in the face of or in the light of neoliberalism, I think this was a great advances that we kind of insisted that the public sector is producing public value, or that is what we should focus upon. Moreover, in the later discussion, I think it has been fair. There's been a fair criticism of Mark Moore, because he kind of told a story about, you know, where the public managers were the heroes. You know, public value management was therefore criticized for being too managerial. You know, it was like only public managers, you know, who had the, you know, the insight and competence and time and energy to produce public value for society. And that's of course not true. But what is important for me is that, you know, as soon as we start focusing on public value production, I think we also get to realize that it's not only public managers, but a broad range of public and private actors involving citizens, neighborhoods, civil society, etc., who can all contribute to public value production. And in that sense, I do see public value, the concept of public value, as a game changer, leading us to a growing embrace of value co-creation. You know, to see that there are manifold actors who can come together and collaborate and exchange ideas and views and exchange resources and so on in networks and partnerships and produce public value. And that is something that we desperately need in our society. And I buy the whole diagnosis of the current predicament that we heard just before. Public value is, in my understanding, something that we co-create. And co-creation for me is when two or more public-private actors, they come together, ideally on an equal footing, to collaborate to both define the problem at hand and then also to design and implement new and better solutions, perhaps through continuous improvement or through some kind of disruption, as we also talked about before, producing innovation. So defining co-creation in this way, just it's important for me to say that this means, of course, that co-creation is not when citizens are consulted with about, almost fixed public planning solutions in the very last minute before they are implemented. That has for me nothing to do with co-creation. Neither is co-creation when public tasks are dumped at the feet of weak local communities, as we saw in Britain with the big society vision, where they just cut down on the public sector and expected somehow that civil society would lift or shoulder the burden that the public sector would no longer shoulder. And neither, finally, is co-creation about contracting out public services. Co-creation in really involves this exchange between different actors early in the process with the aim of producing public value. And this is just for me to illustrate why I find co-creation as being like a disruptive idea about governance, because for many years we saw governance as something that was produced top down through a chain of government. Actually, it started with the voters electing politicians who were making laws and communicating these laws to administrators who would instruct professionals about how to deliver service solutions to citizens as clients. And what I always wondered about, or what struck me as really odd, is that we constructed a system of governance whereby multiple agents would do something one by one. They would each do their task in a serial of connections, but never do anything together. There would never be a moment in the traditional chain of government where all these different actors would sit around the same table and ask themselves, what is the problem and what could be a potential solution? So that is what we try to achieve through co-creation. We ask all these different actors to step out of their comfort zone and enter a common space where they work together to define, put a handle on problem, and design and implement an experiment with new solution. And I just think, that movement from a linear perspective on governance to a much more complex systemic notion of governance is a great leap forward. Okay, so if co-creation really works, and it doesn't always do that, but if it really works, there's a lot of potential achievements. For example, like enhancing service quality, because co-creation builds or seeks to mobilize the experiences, ideas, and resources of relevant and affected actors. And that's very important for actually hitting the target with new solutions and services. Co-creation may also help to bridge the gap or the polarization of society today, bringing different groups together around really concrete problem solving. You might have all kinds of different polarized ideological views, but when it comes down to making your neighborhood greener or solving a dispute about land, concrete problems, it's often much easier to bring people together and create trust and cohesion through interaction and collaboration. Co-creation may also stimulate innovation, because when we come together, being a diverse group of actors, we often we disturb each other's way of thinking, and out of that disturbance comes some kind of mutual learning, and out of learning, innovation. And more than that, co-creation may also help to build common ownership to innovative and disruptive solutions, making it possible to implement them in practice. Last but not least, co-creation also has a democratic or democratizing potential, in the sense that it enhances citizens and neighborhoods democratic influence at the output side of the political administrative system. And this is important because for so long we have gotten used to only having democratic influence at the input side as voters. Co-creation gives us a new way of being a part of the solution at the output side of the political and administrative system. So all this work on co-creation that I'm currently doing I try to put to work now in this book on sustainable development goals. And I think there's something really interesting about the sustainable development goals. First of all, the United Nations have only passed, to my knowledge, 3 unanimous decisions ever. The first was the establishment of the United Nations. The second was the agreement on the Human Declaration of Rights. And the third unanimous decision was to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I find is fascinating about the Sustainable Development Goals is that these goals, are the same for each and every country in the world. And they come with targets and indicators and so on. So it's actually the first time that we have a unified policy agenda for the entire planet, and everybody can kind of measure themselves up against a common policy goal defined in the same way, of course, translated in each country. One more thing is striking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is they come with their own recipe for how to achieve them. And what is particularly interesting for me is to look at the so-called Goal 17, which basically says that all the first 16 goals should be achieved through collaboration and co-creation in networks and partnerships. So the recommendation of the United Nations, one of the most trustworthy, maybe not the most powerful, but one of the most legitimate and trustworthy organizations in the whole entire world, this organization now recommends networks and partnerships bringing together public and private actors in devising new innovative solutions to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's what I'm writing a book about with Eva and with Chris Ansell. And we actually have 3 high-level UN persons being associate authors of this book, because we are writing this book for practitioners all over the world as a kind of, a research-informed or research-based reflection on how to actually co-create at the local level those global sustainable development goals. And in this book, we will look at how to translate goals to the local level to generate some local ownership to the goals. We will be looking at how to convene actors, how to create interaction between them, and how to use this interaction to produce more effective solutions, more innovative solutions, more democratic solutions. And we also look at distributed leadership, how we can distribute leadership tasks within a group of co-creating actors, how we can invent completely new ways of evaluating processes in co-creation. And that is necessary because in co-creation, also the goals are subject to negotiation and transformation, and therefore the traditional ways of evaluating governance will not do. And we are working to develop some new ideas about that, as we are also developing new ideas about how to ensure accountability when you are seeing public solutions produced in and through co-creation with many hands and many eyes. So that's basically, at least one way of seeing or approaching what I am and what Eva is also doing. We are doing a lot of this research on co-creation and trying to apply it to many different things like the Sustainable Development Goals. We have another project on the green transition. And right now we are actually trying to construct a new project where we will do global comparative case studies of co-creation of Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll see how that goes. Thank you very much.